the Algorithmic Fairness and Obesity Working Group, so I'm quite excited to hear more about that. And then she has a book called Invisible Users, Youth in the Internet Cafe of Urban Ghana, which came out in 2012. So let's hear more from
She has a new book coming out next month.
Let's hear more from Jenna.
Get my notes pulled up here. So this talk was originally, had the word human autonomy in it. I've renamed it a little bit based on how this research is shaping up and how our focus has been kind of taking shape. So it's now called When Users Control the Algorithms. And I'm going to just start with a little bit of background before I get into the particular study that I'm going to talk about today. The research behind this talk started with this sort of a hunch that some of the anxiety around, that seemed to be bubbling up around algorithmic decision making was not really about problems of errors or bias or fairness, but was more fundamentally about what it meant for humans to be subject to automation. So imagining that you have something at stake. You're trying to get a loan, for example, and many of us have gone through that. Your credit score is really important. So having something at stake and having no way to really know or to challenge a machine entity that's making a decision about your fate. That's sort of some scene setting. So particularly from reading scholars like Virginia Eubanks, she has a book I definitely would recommend called Automating Inequality. She spent lots of time looking at poor people, basically, who are subject to kind of algorithmic decision making in social services and what those experiences are like. And I think reading those kind of narrative accounts really hammers home, that feeling of what it means to really be truly powerless before a system that's making critical decisions about your life. So before I get into those questions about control and autonomy and even personhood or human dignity, I'm going to back up a bit. Plug my working group, the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Working Group at UC Berkeley. I started this group a couple of years ago with my colleague Deirdre Mulligan, who's a law scholar. And this was one of the slides that I created when I was trying to attract some faculty on campus to join the group. And some of it was reflecting sort of our indecision. So we picked a set of words. We have a nice acronym that's gives you some sense of clouds and fog. We have a lot of fog in the Bay Area. And that worked with these terms, algorithmic fairness and opacity. But, there are lots of discussions about fairness. That word has become really prominent in a certain kind of subfield that attracts computer scientists. But, we might ask whether the question or the word we should be using is instead bias or discrimination or inequality. And the same with questions about transparency. Transparency is one word. Interpretability, a lot of computer scientists are writing about interpretability. I think law scholars I talk to tend to talk about accountability a bit more. These aren't interchangeable. They all have kind of developed slightly different definitions, and there's actually just a mountain of work trying to define the terms. But what I think this field, so the broader field that I'm aligning this work with, that AFOG belongs to, is around ethics in artificial intelligence, or more specifically in machine learning. And what that field, I think, has so far done that's been really helpful is, they've intervened in some conversations, pointed out, maybe the most critical point, which is that machine learning, by virtue of being computational or statistical, that doesn't ensure that decision making is free from things like racism or sexism or any other forms of bias we might be concerned about. So that's one contribution. And the other contribution, I think, is that this field of ethics and machine learning has really brought a slew of values. And each of these words maybe represents a value into conversations about technology design. This is not, I will say, this is not the first time we've been talking about values. There's a strong tradition, including in HCI. There's value-sensitive design, there's values in design. But perhaps what's happening here is sort of a shift in intensity, just a revitalization of that area. And so these represent kind of one word, priorities, values. I put this up here just to show you a bunch of kind of competing concepts and just to suggest that we might think about what's not on the list. Why are these the concerns that we're really focusing on in this area? Why are some of these terms getting more attention than others, and what's absent from the list? So I'm going to take fairness to start with, because fairness has gotten a lot of attention and has quickly produced really a mountain of scholarship. So fairness, why is fairness so popular? Why is the value of fairness becoming so central in discussions about ethics and machine learning? One reason I will say is because I think it's really amenable to formalism. It's a concept that can be defined in a way that allows you to analyze it, validate it, implement it. You know, there are people working on fairness algorithms. And by contrast to, for example, interpretability, that's something that computer scientists have been working on, but struggling because it's really hard to come up with like a formal definition of interpretability. So the other thing about fairness is that some of the work in that area has really started from something that machine learning is concerned with, which is accuracy. So because machine learning is statistical, the accuracy is never perfect. You have a machine learning classifier, classifies someone as likely to default on a loan or not, for example. You have problems with false positives. So the people who you think are going to default, but they don't, or the people you think are not going to default, but they do, right? So some of the fairness research has just started from that point and said, well, how are those errors distributed across populations? Like, are there certain groups that are getting more false positives attached to them and other groups that are getting more false negatives? So let me give you an example. In the community of people looking at ethics and machine learning, everybody knows what COMPAS is, I think. I don't know how many people here have heard about COMPAS or the ProPublica piece on, okay, so that's a pretty good number in this room as well. COMPAS is a system, a proprietary system that predicts whether a defendant in a criminal case is likely to go out and commit another crime. It's a recidivism risk predictor. And ProPublica is an investigative journalism group that did an analysis of COMPAS. It's a bit of data journalism. And what they found was that the distribution of errors was skewed by race. So for black defendants, they were more likely to get a false positive, meaning they were ranked as high risk and then did not go on to commit a crime. And white defendants were more likely to get a false negative, to be called low risk, and then go on to commit a crime. So you can see there that there's a fairness question, right? And I won't get into the details, but they did all the things to control for, background and things. So they were looking at really, black defendants and white defendants who really looked very similar and were getting different risk scores. So that's sort of the heart of a lot of the fairness debate, is really about distribution of a resource, the distribution of errors in this case, and how fair or unfair that is. There have been other people in this community who've stepped in to say, okay, well we should call that allocative fairness. That's not the only way to talk about fairness. The other perspective we might take is on representational fairness. And if you're looking at things like Google Images or natural language processing algorithms, there's been some really interesting work lately looking at things like, if you do a Google image search for a CEO, you get a huge number of men and very few women, right? So, and then there's some natural language processing work that's looked at how analogies are produced. So man is to doctor as woman is to nurse is one of these patterns that gets produced, looking at kind of patterns in reality, but also reinforcing certain stereotypes, right? So that's more in the realm of representational fairness. Kate Crawford did a talk at the NeurIPS conference a couple of years ago where she really defined very clearly that difference, so you can watch her talk if you're interested in looking into that. And then I think the law scholars in this space have stepped in to say, well, okay, fairness, maybe we can stretch the definition of fairness, but maybe fairness is just too limited a concept and we should be talking about something much broader like justice. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a quite different story about COMPASS, the same system that we were just talking about, which does recidivism risk scoring. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a man named Glenn Rodriguez. This is a story that law scholar Rebecca Wexler wrote about in a piece online. She's joining Berkeley next year at the law school, and I think her work is great. I think this story tells us something different about COMPASS and risk scoring systems in general, and some other concerns we might bring into the conversation, particularly concerns about control over algorithms. So when Glenn Rodriguez was 16, he was convicted of second-degree murder and went to prison. He was involved in an armed robbery at a car dealership. And he had been there for 26 years. So this is much later in his life. The piece about him described him as a model of rehabilitation. So he'd taken college courses. He'd spent 4.5 years training service dogs for military injured military vets. He'd volunteered in a youth program. He'd had not a single disciplinary infraction in all of his time there. And he was going up for parole. He was denied parole, and the parole board explained that his COMPASS score had ranked him as high risk. And he didn't know why. The board didn't know why. And it's a proprietary algorithm, so Northpoint, the company that designs this system, isn't really interested in disclosing exactly how it works either. But Mr. Rodriguez was in prison, so he had some time. And he started to do this process of kind of ad hoc reviewing, trying to do an ad hoc review of his own COMPASS score, trying to figure out how it was constructed, what the inputs were, how it ended up deciding that he was high risk. He asked around to other inmates about their backgrounds and their scores, and eventually, through this kind of, canny, strategic approach to trying to figure things out, he determined that there's a question 19, that asks, does this person have notable disciplinary issues in prison? He determined that had been scored incorrectly for him, that it had said that he had disciplinary problems in prison when he absolutely had not. So there was an error, but there was no process of recourse. So he talked to the rehabilitation coordinator at the prison. She agreed that it should be changed, but there was no clear process for doing that. He filed a formal complaint. He sent letters to attorneys, including Rebecca Wexler. The score was not fixed. There was no process for fixing it. He did get parole a year later anyways, even without the score being corrected, but I don't know about you, I don't find that very reassuring. But I think this story really gets to potentially that deep sense of powerless, that sense of automated systems putting people in a position where they just have to kind of accept the decisions that are made by them, whether or not they're erroneous, and without really having insight into how they're being made. A more fair COMPASS algorithm, one where the false positives or false negatives are redistributed in a more fair way, that wouldn't have done anything for him. That wouldn't have helped. And because this is an HCI audience, I just want to point out that he's not really the user of this system. He's being subject to this algorithmic scoring system, but he doesn't get to enter the input data. He's not sitting in front of a computer doing anything with this algorithm. Someone's doing it on his behalf. Someone who is less invested in his parole release. And I think that's an important point because many algorithmic classifiers used in high-stake domains like this have people who are subject to them who are indirect users or who are non-users. And so that really kind of twists the way we might think about design, I think. So Virginia Eubanks, her book, gonna plug it one more time, go read it, it's great. She says the essential question should be, does the tool increase the self-determination and agency of those subject to it? And we're just not asking that question enough. And so that's what I'm gonna talk about today. Questions of control. So that other story of the COMPASS algorithm, I think, raises a critical concern, but one that's so far been a little less central to the academic conversation, so I'm going to try and make it more central today. where does control fit into that alphabet soup of acronyms? It's not fairness. And there is actually a little bit in the existing literature about generally talking about human autonomy. And most of that in the current literature is by law scholars. So autonomy, that's kind of an amorphous concept. There are a couple of ways that people have written about it. One argument is that being subject to automation is just inherently dehumanizing. That if you're being reduced to sort of a data subject or a number or a set of traits, you're being objectified. This underpins actually some of the what's written into the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR in the EU, has this kind of undercurrent of human autonomy under by this definition. And actually, one of my colleagues just emailed the text of a bill that Senator Wyden and Booker just proposed on. It's the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2019, which you should all go look at. It looks very much like it's following in the footsteps of the GDPR. And it includes a provision saying people have a right to recourse and to review and to having a human kind of look at the decisions made about them through automated systems. The second kind of way that autonomy is defined relates to being able to make choices. So not just that automation dehumanizes us inherently, but autonomy is about being able to make choices, being able to act on your own behalf. If you're not, then you're simply not free. And I think that second definition gets more at this issue of control over algorithms. And I want to just point out that there's a literature already. I mean, from the 90s, in HCI in particular, there has been work on human control over AI, over machine learning. And there's also been sort of a recent revival in HCI around this topic. The phrase, I think, is often intelligence augmentation. That's the term for it. So if you go search on that, you'll find some good stuff. I think often that has really looked at the cognitive gains that are realized by leveraging human forms of intelligence and putting that into partnership with machines. And I certainly think that's well worth going back and kind of mining that insight from the older literature and paying attention to the new literature. But what I'm talking about today is not simply about cognition, but it's from a values perspective, control as a value to uphold, potentially. And that's more anchored in debates in law and political philosophy. So in trying to kind of go forward with this idea, to grapple with this question of control over the algorithm, I was looking for something in the literature a little bit more than this kind of diffuse mentions of human autonomy. And what I did find that was really helpful was work that defined illegitimate control over algorithms, AKA gaming the algorithm. There's a couple of really interesting pieces about gaming the algorithm that have helped me kind of think about this space. And so I'm going to highlight two of them before I get into talking about my study that I carried out this past year with my PhD students. So two definitions of gaming that give us a good kind of running start at thinking about this topic. The first is by Moritz Hart and his collaborators. Moritz is a colleague of mine at Berkeley. He wrote a piece about strategic classification. And basically gaming always seems to have a kind of negative connotations. And the kind of harm that he identifies with gaming is harm to the prediction accuracy of a classifier, and a harm that gives unintended advantage to the gamer. So he talks about, in both cases, they seem to talk about like academic-related classifiers. So he talks about how college admissions decisions might be made. And so you can imagine a algorithm that might take all kinds of different inputs and try to determine whether a potential student seems like a good bet for admitting into your college. And one of the inputs he proposes, well, maybe it's, we know that if you have a lot of books in your home, that's a good indication that you'll do well in school. That's potentially one of those things that you might find in a classifier. correlates with success in school. So if you know that, if the algorithm is exposed to public scrutiny, that's the way he describes it, well, just go out and buy a bunch of books. Go get secondhand books, fill your house with books, and now you can look more college ready, right? You don't have to read the books, you just have them in your house. So that would be an example of gaming by this definition. If enough people do that, the classifier is no longer very helpful, right? It starts to classify people who maybe aren't ready for college. They just have a lot of books because they knew that was a way to get the algorithm to work in their favor. But by that definition, I think there are openings for ways that people might control algorithms that aren't necessarily gaming. So if they're doing things that don't harm the accuracy of the classifier, or if they're doing things that that don't give them advantage, whatever advantage might mean. Then we sort of see there's an opening for control over algorithms that's not necessarily gaming. The second piece is it's a long law review article, which is maybe the most comprehensive kind of philosophical analysis or review of the concept of gaming by Bambauer and Zarsky. These are both pretty recent publications. And their definition is somewhat similar. So they observe that the way algorithms, classify is based on proxies, right? We are using inputs that are the things we can measure, which stand in for the thing we're actually interested in, right? So there's a gap between the thing we measure and the thing we're really trying to assess, and that's where gaming happens. So, for example, another academic example. SAT scores, right, are a proxy for college readiness. And I think we've seen recently in the news that SAT scores can be gamed. There are people kind of working behind the scenes to manipulate those scores as a way to gain admissions to colleges that they're not, to gain undue advantage in Hart's terms. So certainly, by that definition, you can think about control over the algorithm as kind of a legitimate control, as something where you're changing the thing that the proxy is meant to measure. So you're becoming more college ready in some way, right? That's a way you might exert control over an algorithm that's not gaming. So kind of authentic changes in your behavior. And actually, our laws around credit scoring and disclosure to consumers center around making sure people can be educated about how to have better credit so they can get a better score, so they can qualify for a loan in the future. Okay, so let me get into the study that we carried out. And I'm trying to take a look at the time. Okay. So I'm very interested in these high stakes domains like loans and lending and criminal justice. Ideally, that would be the place to go do some data collection, but we didn't do that. We looked at Twitter data. Not exactly the same thing, not exactly high stakes, but still illuminating for thinking about control. So this past fall and into January, I had a team of 3 PhD students I was working with. For 12 weeks, we collected, using the Twitter API, we collected all of the tweets that people tweeted that referred to Twitter's algorithms, or Twitter algorithms, any variant of that phrase. And we collected 8,875 tweets. That's actually pretty small for a Twitter data set. And those tweets came from 8,041 distinct user accounts, so it wasn't like a small number of people tweeting about algorithms over and over again. About half were original tweets and half were in reply to someone. And then what we did with those tweets, we did a kind of interpretive content analysis and developed a set of codes inductively that kind of covered the themes we found in what people were doing, what they seemed to be doing when they talked about the Twitter algorithm or Twitter algorithms. So, a lot of the work in the space has been really about defining the terms, and we wanted to kind of ground our thinking about control in some sort of evidence, right? Some sort of basis in evidence. So that was the reason why we did this study, to kind of explore that concept of control with some data about how users are behaving on a platform that uses algorithmic systems. And what I think was really interesting about these tweets is that they were they were these moments in time, that we captured these moments where someone using Twitter kind of turned to this thing that was really meant to be a background process and acknowledged it. And often it was in a moment where it became visible to them, where something went wrong or something puzzled them, but they knew enough to kind of invoke this word algorithm. Okay, I had a personal story. So I was getting my hair cut, and my hairstylist asked what I was going to talk about, and I started explaining it. I didn't use the word algorithms because I don't assume people know that word, but I started explaining it, and she was like, "Oh, you mean algorithms?" And I had a sense that word is going very mainstream, but it's been interesting to see how mainstream or under what conditions people know that word. And for her, it was because she had done some social media training, basically, like how to promote your business on social media. And so as part of that, she had been told about algorithms and trying to kind of take advantage of how the algorithms work. So that was very interesting. And the possibility of the study really rests on the fact that a lot more people are talking about algorithms than back when I was an undergrad CS major. So here are a few example tweets, and then on your left is incomplete set of the codes we arrived at inductively. So we had 10 that we ultimately used as our code book. I'm highlighting just a small number. There were 4 kind of meta categories that we put codes under. So one was tweets about the Twitter algorithm that were about explaining how it works, or people puzzling over it, trying to understand how it works. There were complaints where people had some problem that they were blaming on the algorithm, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. There were people who were, this is really interesting, they were doing what we described as relationship management. So they were shifting the blame from themselves or from a person to the algorithm. So if someone felt like they weren't getting attention on Twitter, someone might come in and say, "Oh, it's the algorithms. It's not that people don't like what you're putting on Twitter, it's they're not seeing your tweets." So kind of relationship management. And then the final category, it's all the way down at the bottom of the slide, but that's sort of the most important one for this topic. We found lots of tweets where people were actually invoking the algorithm in the process of trying to do something to it, trying to exert some control over it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. So this first tweet, I think, is a good example of relationship management. So it's not actually managing a relationship, but reflecting on the way the Twitter algorithms get in the way of your relationship with someone that you connect with on Twitter. So he says, "When I realize I haven't seen a Twitter friend tweet in a while, but I realized that might be because Twitter's algorithm hasn't been surfacing their tweets. So I do an actual search for their account, and sure enough, they've been tweeting good tweets I haven't been supporting. So this person feels they've neglected a friendship because they haven't been seeing their tweets." And then there's this tweet, someone's talking about basically this problem of context collapse, where you have lots of different possible audiences that are people, like communities you belong to, but they're all kind of collapsed together on Twitter. So he said, "I deeply apologize to anyone who's seen gay porn as a result of me liking it. Twitter algorithms are hard at work once again." And then the final tweet is an example of someone complaining about control, complaining about the way other users manipulate the algorithms to control people. So this tweet says, "Certain people are flagging tweets containing violent words like murder and kill. Twitter's algorithm, of course, can't distinguish role play from real-life threats. Someone's exploiting this. They want to suspend accounts they have a problem with." So that's an example of a control-related tweet. So let me just say a little bit about complaints. So people, about half of we coded half of the tweets that we collected as having a negative sentiment. So about half of the tweets people were tweeting were complaints about the algorithms, and there were sort of 4 main themes. One is where people complained that there was an error, and often that was a problem of personalization, like someone feels like they're seeing content that says something about them that's not correct. There were a series of tweets where people complained about seeing ads for Rolex watches. Like, really, Twitter, you think I can afford a Rolex watch? You really don't you've not you've not personalized your data about me very well, right? The second category of complaints were about bias and unfairness. And there's one very dominant theme in those complaints. Typically, it was political conservatives in the US complaining that the algorithm was muting attention for their tweets. So basically, if the platform's distributing attention, it's doing it in this unfair way that gives liberals more attention than conservatives. And another conversation I had, the driver who drove me over here from Roanoke, we got into a conversation. I was telling him about my talk. He didn't know what the word algorithms was, but he said, oh, I've been hearing about conservatives being shadow banned and having their messages kind of muted on Twitter. So he knew about that idea of algorithms being biased, even if he didn't know the word. The third category of complaints had to do with seeing or not seeing things. So the algorithms that people seem to be most concerned with on Twitter were curation algorithms, the ones that sort of filter and rank and organize your timeline, or the order of replies to a tweet, or recommend who to follow, or set Twitter trends. So grouping those all together and calling them curation algorithms. And that fundamentally what those algorithms do is decide what you see or don't see. And so a lot of the complaints were about seeing things that they didn't want to see, or not seeing things that they did. And then the final complaint category that we found, and I'll admit that complaints about control were pretty small in the grand scheme of complaining on Twitter. But there were some number of tweets that complained about people feeling censored, like their behavior on the platform was being controlled, that they couldn't say certain things because it would be picked up by content moderation processes. Okay, so I did want to just highlight what it is that Twitter says about their Twitter algorithms. And I'm just looking at the text from their website about the timeline, because that was the one that people tweeted about the most. So they explain, they don't use the word algorithm, which is interesting. They explain that your top tweets, so they order what's in your timeline by some algorithmic process. They say those are the tweets you are likely to care about most. And then the only explanation they give is that it's based on accounts you interact with most, tweets you engage with, and much more. Hand waving, big hand waving. It's based on much more than that, but you don't get to know what exactly it is. Our goal is to show you content on your home timeline that you're most interested in, and that contributes to the conversation in a meaningful way. I think that's alluding to content moderation, such as content that is relevant, credible, and safe. So it doesn't use the word algorithm. It uses these kind of vaguely positive descriptors: relevant, credible, safe. And it infers the subjective view of the user. It says, these are the things you're likely to care about. It doesn't insist, but it suggests that this is what we think you're going to care about. I think the reason I put this up is just to point out that it seems pretty apparent from how Twitter works and how they describe these processes, that what they expect from users in relation to these curation algorithms is that users will really influence those algorithms passively and indirectly. Like, they're not really meant to know there's an algorithm, or to invoke the algorithms, or to try and do things to the algorithms. So when users do that, when they talk about algorithms, when they seem to have these moments of algorithmic awareness, they're exerting a kind of control that's not explicitly granted by the platform. I have a colleague, or someone I know who used to work at Twitter, so I ran this by him. I'm like, do you think Twitter would care about the things that I'm finding in this, what people are doing about trying to control the algorithm? And he admitted that probably not. We're talking about things that are on a scale that's pretty small, where people are influencing, their experience of the platform. Probably not something Twitter's really worried about. But I do think it's interesting to see how, Twitter sets up what it expects people to understand about those processes. And it's not really inviting you to know about the algorithms in much detail, or to invoke them directly. Okay, so what are people doing on Twitter? Just kind of looking across all of the tweets, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail and then wrap up. each of these tweets, I mean, they were from different accounts. It was very interestingly kind of disconnected data, but a whole kind of a pattern of practice emerged out of those individual tweets. And I found them to be really a valuable index to a wide range of sub-communities and practices on the platform. So, you know, we saw tweets from like fan Twitter. Fan Twitter is an interesting place. Political Twitter. You know, just interpersonal tweets between friends, professional networks, journalists. I mean, it ran the gamut, really. And one thing you can kind of gauge from the tweets about Twitter is that it's really a sort of a one-size-fits-all platform. Everyone's subject to the same algorithms, and there's not a whole lot that you can configure as a user. And so what users were doing when they were trying to control those Twitter algorithms, kind of in sum, is they're trying to kind of they weren't trying to monopolize attention on the platform, which is how some people have talked about gaming in the past. They were trying to configure or customize attention. So algorithmically aware techniques were trying to define communities, the boundaries of those communities. Sometimes they're trying to get their message out, find a bigger audience. Sometimes they're trying to limit their audience. Sometimes they were trying to make do when the platform produced some kind of error. And sometimes they were trying to resist the intrusions of the platform, including through content moderation practices. So it was pretty wide-ranging, but I think the sum is that these were practices of kind of customizing the community and the level of attention they were receiving on the platform. Not always trying to gain attention, sometimes trying to limit attention, which is interesting. So I'm going to just go through 3 slides that talk in a little bit more detail with examples about what people were doing when they were trying to control the Twitter algorithms. One category was very individual. People were trying to personalize, especially their feed, their timeline. Sometimes they were just trying to get Twitter to do better what Twitter already wanted to do, like give them more content that was more personalized, that was more true to their interests. And so what that meant was they'd often just, instead of kind of naturally liking or retweeting things, they'd start to more actively try to manipulate how the system was reading their interests. They would be more diligent about liking things or about retweeting things or about following and unfollowing people. Some people were trying to what they call escape the filter bubble. So they were trying to follow accounts that were outside of their kind of worldview. They're trying to mix up the content they were getting in their timeline. And then some people were really trying to resist the platform's attempt to know them better, to match them with advertisers. They didn't want to be known. They wanted more privacy on that platform. And so they would do things to try to obfuscate the way the algorithms worked. There's some really great writing about this. There's a book by Finn Bunton and Helen Niesenbaum called Obfuscation, which goes into lots of detail about those strategies. So they didn't want, having an awareness of how platforms try to collect all this data about us, they wanted to disrupt that process. And sometimes they were doing things that undermine the business model of the platform. So someone in this tweet is talking about the Twitter algorithm growing panicked as I mute more accounts that give me ads. I don't think that works. You can, close all the ads you want on Twitter. They'll still keep giving you ads, but so there's one strategy. This tweet refers to this kind of practice of obfuscation. This person doesn't really say what they did, but they said they decided to investigate what Twitter algorithms think of me. I haven't checked before on this account. Damn, whatever I'm doing right as it's all over the place. So there's this little box in Twitter that will tell you what age range they think you're in and what languages you speak. And this person found that the kind of description of them was so broad as to be meaningless, and they liked that. They felt that they had kind of preserved their privacy. So those were individual strategies. I think for me, maybe the more interesting ones were collaborative. So this is where people were tweeting about the Twitter algorithm and doing it in producing directives for other users, trying to get people to join in on their strategies of exerting some kind of control over algorithmic processes, generally because they recognize that some of the ways that the algorithm works depends on aggregate behavior. So if they can produce intentionally that aggregate behavior, they'll be more powerful on the platform. One example of that I'm calling campaigns. So I've learned a lot about Korean boy bands in the process of doing this project. There's a couple, there's EXO and there's BTS. And they have a very robust fan culture on Twitter. And they do these campaigns where they try to get these bands to trend. And sometimes the different groups of fans compete against each other to get their favorite group to trend. And in this one case, there was some kind of problem with a hashtag. So fans started to talk about the Twitter algorithm to one another to say, we need to use a different hashtag. We need to start this campaign over. We need to correct the way we're doing it. Everyone start joining in on using this new hashtag so that we can get our band, our favorite band, to trend. And then in political Twitter, there's interesting things going on around not just trying to get attention for a political issue, but trying to ensure that a political figure that you despise or a topic you are opposed to doesn't get attention on the platform because you've responded critically. That seems to be a really tricky thing people are trying to manage on Twitter. So there's a hashtag called use screenshots that there's actually a lot of tweets. If you want to search on use screenshots, you'll find lots of examples. This guy referred to use screenshots to try and correct someone who was, retweeting I can't remember. It'd be helpful if I could remember exactly what the case was, but someone was retweeting something, saying something critical about it, but nonetheless it was sort of boosting engagement for that topic, and there was a misinformation concern. So this person was trying to correct that behavior by saying, don't retweet, do a screenshot and tweet the screenshot, and then you deny attention to that group or that individual that you oppose. So there's another example of collaborative control, which isn't about trying to get as much attention on the Twitter platform. It's about denying attention to other groups. So these kind of manipulations of attention and kind of creations of community that I've been talking about. Okay. I think this is my second to last slide. So wrapping it up. I think a lot of what seemed to be going on with these tweets was users trying to really take over the platform's role as arbiter, including trying to deplatform certain groups. And sometimes that looks like harassment. But there's a case, so I looked at a long thread where someone was warning people on Twitter, their followers, that pedophiles have gathered on Tumblr and they've been kicked off of that platform, and now they're coming to Twitter, and we have to fight and make sure they don't get to build community here and normalize that behavior and find kind of comfort in on this new platform. So that was the warning, and then there was a list of accounts that belonged to this group. The person who tweeted said, here's some of the code language that people in this pedophile community use, and here's what we should do to fight it. So this is a tweet that popped up in our data set that refers to that thread. So the person said that they considered it child abuse, so they've been using the content moderation features to report those accounts and report their tweets as threatening violence or physical harm. They show some uncertainty. I don't know what's most effective with the Twitter algorithm, but that was the strategy, and there was a big group of people trying to deplatform the pedophile community that was finding its way to Twitter. Okay, so in sum, I think what hopefully these examples show you by those definitions of gaming, not all control over algorithms really counts as gaming by those definitions. You can see some of these practices seem perfectly justifiable. And what Twitter users are really doing when they talk about Twitter algorithms, they seem to be drawing boundaries around their communities. Sometimes they're protecting themselves from abuse or harassment on the platform. They are resisting the platform's relentless push toward engagement, trying to get them to engage with people, including people they really dislike or they're in conflict with, because all of that gets read as engagement. And they're showing some of the errors of the platform. For example, I think one of the main problems with the Twitter platform that many people recognize is it's so poor at recognizing sentiment. So if you talk about how terrible Toyota cars are, it will give you an ad for Toyota cars, like as though you are interested in buying one now, right? So a lot of people recognizing those problems with sentiment, problems with recognizing humor, problems with sarcasm, problems with role play, like those are legitimate problems people have been having on the platform, which, through content moderation or content filtering does things that don't make sense. And so my conclusion is, as I've already said, that control isn't necessarily gaming, and that there's value in control, and there's sort of a fundamental value. This is from a piece by Andrew Selps and Salam Barakis, who say that there is general value in empowering people to navigate the algorithms that affect their lives. And from that piece on gaming by Bamber and Zarsky, there are justifiable defenses of gaming itself. So some of the control practices I've been talking about are not gaming, and also gaming, even by those definitions, might be justifiable. So people who engage in it can represent the full range of ethical motives, from parasitic to benign to downright noble. I think in talking about Twitter users trying to get control of these algorithms, it may seem like I'm suggesting that Twitter shouldn't be in charge, users should be in charge. What I'm actually suggesting is that we think about control in a more distributed sense. So certainly, there's been some debate about harassment on Twitter. I certainly don't think that users should just have to handle that themselves or have more control or be burdened with all of that work of doing their own content moderation. I think what is potentially interesting to explore here is who are all the different groups that might be involved. If we don't treat it as something that either the platform does or users do, perhaps opening up opportunities for third-party groups to do things like audit the platform, to have a role for, say, humans who are acting on behalf of vulnerable groups, stakeholders. So the argument here is not that burdens should be shifted from platforms to users, but I think there's just a much richer debate and discussion about control that I would like to see us start to have. And I think it's probably obvious here, but HCI obviously is a great field for kind of taking up those questions and exploring them and thinking about alternative interfaces and how control might be distributed across platforms like Twitter. And then I want to finally acknowledge my 3 PhD students, Zoe Kahn, Daniel Griffin, and Ann Jonas, who worked on this with me, and also academic Twitter. That they were very helpful with my lit review. I put out a tweet about gaming the algorithm, and I got tons of stuff from Twitter users, academic Twitter users. So thank both of those groups of people. And I'm ready for questions. Yes?
I was wondering if you had any thoughts, or if any of your data suggests, the relationship between what people are perceiving as attempts to control, or perceiving as a lack of control within the algorithm, and how closely that aligns with what the algorithm is actually doing, whether or not their control is actually working, or if they're creating entirely disconnected ideas about what's happening.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one thing we did when we were coding the tweets is we tried to attach an algorithm to each tweet. Like, is there plausibly something algorithmic that's going on here? And in most cases, we were able to say, oh, well, they're talking about the algorithm that sorts content on the timeline. I think it was about 7% of cases that we couldn't find anything algorithmic to the complaint they were having. But then there's also things that we don't know as outsiders exactly how Twitter works. So people were concerned that there were words that, some of it seemed very much like paranoia. They thought Twitter was sorting for certain words, or particularly with the concern that conservative Twitter was being targeted, that certain keywords, like if you talk about false flags, for example, that Twitter would keyword search on those kinds of tweets and do something to kind of mute your voice. And I don't think that's how it's working, honestly. But I actually don't know. And there has been some good literature, some good publications both about the degree to which people are aware that their algorithms sorting content. We started from the point of, all of our data was basically people who acknowledged there were algorithms operating in some way. So there's that separate literature. And then there is a literature on folk theories about algorithms, which you can mine and take a look at. I think I've seen the argument made that people are unhappy with the algorithms because they don't know how they work. And I think that I don't buy it. I don't think that's the source of the problem. I don't think it's just that with enough transparency, people will accept and understand and be happy with these processes. But that argument has been made. Yeah.
So there's a book of Ian Whitten et al. Called Web Dragons, which talks about search engines and the issues of those in terms of all the many things you raised here. People don't seem to care about any of that because I guess the results come to just them, not in the public domain. Is that the reason why there's more attention? Certainly there's lots of AI and unexplainable phenomena in these search engines.
Do you mean they don't care about, what don't they care about?
People don't raise the kind of issues that you are raising here about the bias, the fairness.
Yeah. When was it published?
A while ago.
I think it also might be that topic has gotten some media coverage. And I think now it's on the radar of a lot, just like the word algorithm is now a word people use. I think algorithmic fairness, I know people who are trying to get the word out that algorithms can be unfair, and I think the reverse of that is now people are seizing on that as an explanation for why, in ways that don't make sense necessarily, as a reason for why things are happening on platforms like Twitter. So I think that's a good question, is whether it's platform specific or whether it's the time period that we're looking at these questions. Yeah. And then I'll go in the back. I see you back there.
So you've been talking about an algorithmic decision-making process with making decisions about a person and removing their agency thereby. And that certainly happens with computers, but that kind of thing has been going on for a very long time. Right? You don't need a computer to take away someone's agency. A person can do it just fine. So how are the conversations about this topic different now versus how it used to be since forever?
Yeah, well, so I think in the legal community there is, they've been having those questions about agency for a long time, and there are these, procedures in place. We have another way of talking about fairness in terms of due process, right? That everyone gets a fair hearing, that the processes are the same for everyone going through the legal system. For example, I think there are a couple of new if we're talking about criminal justice anyway, just to pick an example, some of it's the arrival of these proprietary tools. That it's not just that it may be hard for us to understand how they work anyway, but because they're proprietary, they are so far able to argue that you can deny people who are being subject to them a chance to see how they work because they're proprietary. And actually, I think that's what Rebecca Wexler, the law scholar, is working on, changing laws around that kind of thing. Yeah, so that's one thing that I think is different. But you're right. People have been talking lately about these recidivism risk scoring tools, and I looked into it a little bit. There's a book that's about 10 years old by Harcourt. I can't remember his first name. Harcourt's the last name, called Against Prediction, which is all about these risk scoring tools. And there are tons of them in criminal justice. They've been around for decades. And scholars have been writing about them, but all of a sudden it seems to be a hot topic. And I think some of it's that now it's linked to machine learning and AI with all of the kind of hype and concern about that. Often these tools are not using anything more sophisticated than, logistic regression. Sometimes they're not using machine learning at all. Sometimes I think they're just rule-based systems, but it gets swept up, I think, in that current hype. Yeah, in the back.
I've been teaching courses called Designing to Change Power and Authority. kind of just answered the central question that I was going to ask.
Okay.
But I'm going to invite you to reflect more on it a little bit. Because since I'm a computer scientist, I want to have a design response, right? I want to create conditions under which people exert more control, or better control, or more reflective through design. But you were also talking about legal recourse. And I think a question that's always in my mind is, so part of the issue is that people can't see the system. They don't understand the systems. They're speculating. It's not clear that they would always see the systems even if they knew what the algorithms were, because the whole system, these are what Morton calls hyperobjects.
Mm-hmm.
They're very hard to see.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what are the most powerful levers of change? That's really what I'd like you to reflect on, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Oh, the most powerful levers of change. I mean, I teach at UC Berkeley, so as you can imagine, our students, drive south an hour and then they go work in the industry. So, I mean, I think those people in those firms are very powerful, the people making the decisions about design. And they can make decisions about delegating control. And that's what I encourage them to do. So it's still the case that people in the private sector, in the tech firms, have a lot of power. Other than that, I think what I value about the tweets that I read is that, and what I have learned from the many years of research that I've been doing, is that people find ways to manipulate systems and algorithms even when they're not invited to, right? And I do think that some of those collaborative efforts have been very powerful, right? The ways in which it's fascinating to see people on Twitter tweeting to one another, right? Using the platform itself to explain and then try to control the algorithms. There's a great paper on block lists. So APIs can be a way of granting control. And I know that whether or not a platform provides an API is always kind of a source of debate. But there's a group that used the Twitter API to build a block list. So, certain groups of people facing a lot of harassment on the platform, they shared an interest, and so they were all targeted, typically by the same people. They built this tool, this block list, so that if any one of them blocked someone, it would be blocked for the rest of them. So they're able to use just a little bit of knowledge about how to code to build an adjunct tool onto the platform. The platform didn't build it, but they were able to build it onto it. That gave them a lot more power over controlling harassment that they were facing. So I think there are a lot of these opportunities now that I don't think existed, maybe 20 years ago, to build software on top of software.
Thank you very much,
Oh.
Professor Burrell.